Take it away.
Thank you, Diane. Gyutatamiskat na wow. That term gyutatamiskat na wow is a plural term meant to be said to everybody as an introduction, as a way of greeting everybody. Some people interpret that to mean I shake hands with each and every one of you. I'll just go right into my presentation. I know as teachers, many of us are type A personalities, and then we'll shoot for 45 minutes, if that's correct there, Diane, and then maybe just leave room for some questions at the end, and that would complete 1 hour. Perfect. So hopefully I can share my screen. Before I hear some groans, you might have noticed that we have 44 slides. Don't worry, we are not going through the whole thing. Some of these are obviously meant for just a quick look. But essentially, the question that I received from Diane, that your school division has about 50% of your students that are either First Nations or Aboriginal, and with the nearby First Nations population, what we call feeder schools from surrounding First Nations or Métis communities. And so in a lot of ways, I can identify that teachers may feel ill-equipped. And the challenge is, how do we connect with students? How do we incorporate Indigenous language into the classrooms when we have the curriculum, when we have all the other demands that are put upon us by administration and our daily jobs? And sometimes it does feel like additional items such as Indigenous language revitalization can become a bit of an add-on. And what I hope to do in my presentation is just provide, by way of example, how valuable incorporating Indigenous language can be. And so with that said, the number one thing that we can all do is just to find value and appreciation in what it is that an Indigenous language has to offer. And one of my favorite quotes is, of course, by Nelson Mandela. You know, if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. And so there's a lot to unpack in this little quote in terms of relationship building and getting to know the person that you're talking to, you're trying to build a relationship with. And that language can very well mean a whole host of different things depending on the different region you're at. And a lot of it is basically getting to know the person that you're talking to. And that's simply making an effort to connect. And that's what we all try to do every day as educators and teachers. And by way of connection, this is my reintroduction. Thank you, Diane. That was a wonderful introduction. Just to name off some of the other things that I've done. Getting in front of an audience such as yourselves has always been my goal ever since I was a little boy. A group of what I call change makers. I am currently the Director of Governance at the Assembly of First Nations, and my job is to help put tools in the hands of First Nations so they can determine their own paths moving forward. And I absolutely believe that our Indigenous language has so much to do with traditional governance and still does today. And so I just wanted to briefly mention that. But again, my presentation today is not necessarily here to brag about who I am. Unfortunately, we do have to get those pieces of papers that tell us that, I have a B.Ed or an M.Ed or a Master's in Northern Governance and Development to be able to gain the attention of certain audience members. And I hope that without titles, without too much of a background of my accomplishments, the story itself can, that I have to share will send a message of, again, why Indigenous language is important, why getting to know our students, our Aboriginal students, our Indigenous students, and getting to know their stories is important. So again, by way of introduction, this is myself when I was a boy, a very healthy Cree cheeks. And here we have Nimama, as we say commonly, and a more formal, traditional way, you would say Nigawi, my mother. And this is Nisimisak. These are my two younger siblings. As you can see, I am the oldest. Ustisimau is what I would be called as the oldest son. And those are my two biological siblings. And this is a Nisimis. And there is no specific word to say my younger sister or my younger brother. We simply acknowledge them as Nisimis. That goes for younger sister or younger brother. And this is Kutak Nisimis. These pictures are fairly dated. This one is 13 years old and she is 26 in her last year of university as she becomes she goes for her B.Ed. And my parents are still living in my home community of South End, Ranger Lake. And for some of you that are of a certain age, you might remember Kung Fu and Bruce Lee being all the rage, and especially amongst Indigenous communities that rarely seen somebody like them or they can identify with on TV or in movies or in pop culture. And of course, this is myself in the middle and two of my cousins, Nishtasak. So these are still very good friends of mine that I consider my brothers to this day. And of course, the one in the middle had to, go all in, trying to be Bruce Lee himself, even with the hairstyle. This is Notawi, Nipapa, and Nimama. This is actually a very common picture of what you would see them doing in the winter time today. My dad just came back from Minnesota during the Klondike days, and he put in a team for the race itself. And my mom has always been there to support him in everything that my dad does. And this was my first teacher, Nugum, my grandmother. And people often say my kukum. And that's actually not a term in traditional Cree. My kukum is more of a term of endearment today. And the word kukum literally means your grandmother. But of course, the spirit of older people, especially grandparents, they just see the heart of what you're trying to say, of what you're calling them, knowing that you may not speak the language. So of course, they're not going to correct you to the point where you're starting to build a gap between the relationship that she wants with her grandkids. So of course, my kukum, we've adopted it out of love. And we continue to use that today as we mix Cree and English. So my kukum or my mushum are very acceptable terms, but literally they do not make sense in Cree when you want to speak only Cree. So when you say my grandmother, you say nogum, or my grandfather, nimusom. So I thought what I want to do throughout this presentation, of course, is I'm going to just put on these little gems that I've found out throughout my life and my teaching, and just to be able to share maybe just a wide range of my audience members, yourselves, that may know some of this stuff or may not know very much. And this is my family today. This was taken about 4 years ago. As you can see, my son is quite tall. He's 21. He's 6'7", the only man I look up to. And this is my beautiful wife. This year, we will be married for 23 years. Today, my son is completing his undergrad degree at the University of Carleton in Ottawa, and he wants to go into engineering. And my daughter is 15 and completing her grade 10. She sings, she does a lot of art, and she wants to go into acting, not so much the movie types, but plays and musicals. And my wife works at the University of Carleton as the research facilitator for Indigenous engagement for the university. And again, I point to my grandmother because this is so important that many of us may not have the privilege to have their first favorite teacher in life. And traditionally, that favorite teacher that we often think fondly about is either our older relatives or our grandmother or our grandfather. And as we grow older, and I know some of us are a certain age to have grandkids or maybe even have great grandkids, you notice that the way you parented your own kids is different. You're a lot softer, a lot generous, a lot more kinder, a lot more patient, a lot more loving. And that's just a cycle of what we've always done and appreciated and have acknowledged as Cree people traditionally, which is why we have the word chapan. You know, that word is, again, a Cree English mixture. Chapan means my great grandfather or my great grandmother or my great granddaughter or my great grandson. Now you might wonder, well, why the heck would Cree people only have one word for great grandchild or great grandparent? Did they just simply not have the capacity or imagination to distinguish the two groups? The word chapan comes from nuhtapan, my great grandfather or my great grandmother. Nuhtapan is my great grandchild, and it's a relationship word. In a family traditional camp, you would see that the great grandparents' level of energy, you know, the speed that they walk and move was at the same as the ones that are just, you know, getting on their own 2 feet. And I compare it to, you know, any one of us going into a store or a mall or anywhere, holding the hand of a little one. Sometimes you pull along the little guy this way or the little girl this way, and sometimes they pull you along that way. Notapan is the word that I pull along. So if you pull along a sled or if you pull along or drag along a chair, that very visual right there actually captures the word notapan or nochapan. Nochapan is almost a diminutive term to say my great grandchild or my great grandparent. And so that is almost the complete loop of the life cycle of family kinship terms. And so it's a very, very important term. And of course, again, when people say my chapan, and if you don't know what that means my great grandparent. And don't be surprised if you meet a great grandparent to call their great grandchild that very same term. It's when the beginning of life meets the end of life in that circle of life that many of us have come to see. And again, I want to acknowledge my favorite teacher when I was a little boy that ignited that curiosity in the language that we have today. And my dad was not my favorite teacher growing up. He was strict. He was all about business. We had to wake up early in the morning. We had to work. We had to eat fast. We had to make sure that all the work was done. It was always work, work, work. Whenever I asked any questions about my dad, he would say simply, "There's no time," or "Work first," or "Don't you know?" But now that he's becoming a grandparent himself, that understanding, that patience, that compassion looks a lot like my grandmother when I first started to get to know her as a teacher. And today my grandmother has passed away, and I see those same qualities in my dad. And so that's what I also wanted to mention in terms of our teachers, and why it's important that we acknowledge the different stages of life with our teachers themselves. And I just also wanted to, again, going back to our original question of how we can support Indigenous language revitalization. Number one thing is to create space for dialogue, making a little bit of room. Even if this starts with one word at a time. Of course, we can get into we can expand in terms of how we can incorporate and support Indigenous languages, and it does become complex, and it does involve a lot of aspects and factors and dollars. And so we'll just stick to the main focus of creating space for dialogue. Accepting different ways of knowing is one of the most overlooked, I would say, core principles of a Cree worldview. Cree people have always been adapting and adopting different ways, not just respecting. And one of the reasons why we had our Indigenous people have an oral-based tradition is this very way of looking at the world. Myself, if I was to write down the word, my son's name, Kiano, about 10 different people in our group would spell that very word differently. And of course, a long time ago, it was shared with me that the primary reason why we don't have a written-based language form was simply because of this very principle and value that it is better to accept different ways of knowing traditionally. So I'll just leave it there. Again, there's a lot to unpack there, but we're not here for that. One of those different ways of knowing is acknowledging that Northern people not only had 4 seasons, but we had six seasons. And if you take a look at this very closely, it says Nipin, which is summertime, Tagwagan, fall time or autumn, Migiskau, which means the freeze up of the ice, because the lakes and the rivers, very important for Northern people. And then we have Pipun, which is wintertime, Sigwan, which is springtime, and then we have Migiskau, which is the breakup of the ice. This is when you cannot travel. This is when it's very dangerous to travel. But as you know, many of you that enjoy ice fishing, many of you that enjoy skiing, as the snow starts to disappear on the land, the ice in many northern lakes are still very solid. You can go ice fishing in your t-shirt, which I've done. Very nice day out, and not have to worry about getting too cold because the ice is still very solid and going back to the summertime. And so these pictures here were taken just a couple of years ago back home. As you can see, this is just still very common amongst trappers and a lot of hunters, is they don't need a whole lot of material when they're out in the land. Again, getting fish from the lake, this is a net that has been pulled out, and simply using the material around you. So this part will be very important for land-based educators, maybe incorporating some science in terms of the environment for some of the teachers. And then again, utilizing the resources around us. And then from a historical perspective, you can definitely use this for Native studies or Canadian studies in terms of this picture that you're seeing. The black and white picture is a picture of my own community. And this was how my dad saw his community of anywhere from about 150 to 200 people, which is now ballooned to, I want to say about 1,600 people in the community of South End Ranger Lake. And I point to this because my dad was the first generation of our people that spent their entire lives having a permanent address in the community. My dad is 63 years old. And again, that's not very old, but if you take a look at when people started to come off the land and to make communities their permanent home. So my dad, when I say my dad had a permanent address, that means that a lot of time was spent out there in the community as much as it was spent on the land. He was just as comfortable on the land. He spent half of his time on the land. And when I came around, that time spent on the land was still very much practiced, but not as much, because the traditional economy of fishing, trapping, started to go down, and then more people, as they settled into communities, had to look for a new way to make a living. And again, these are pictures that you can often see that my parents do out in the land every summer. So this is Nigawi, Nimama, this is Nipapa, or more formal Cree, Nuhtawi. And this is smoking whitefish. The Cree word for whitefish does not literally translate to white fish. There's a teaching behind the story of how Atigamig got its name. And for those of you that may know a little bit of Cree, you might pick up that word Atig, that means caribou. This literally translates to caribou fish. Now, there's a story behind it. If you're interested, I can teach you, or I can share with you. It was shared to me by a friend of mine. His name is Isaac Murdoch. That the traditional story of how the whitefish came to be. The reason why that name Atigamig and the Anishinaabe or the Ojibwe people call it by the same word, Atigamig, with a hard G instead of a softer G or a soft K. Jamie, I can definitely share that with you. We can do this again, or maybe you can invite me to your classroom, and then I can share that story, or maybe I can just share with you directly. Thank you very much for the question. The words themselves, I wanna just say are in terms of accepting different ways of knowing. Bigo. This is how you would pronounce that black stuff after that fire is out. Bigo. And that's what I commonly call coffee. Bigo tiwapoy. I did not make up this word. This word has been around for a very long time. And when you start to understand that there's root words connected to some of the words that we commonly use. Unless we start really thinking about the connection, we really don't truly understand why coffee is called pigutiwapoy. Of course, when you take a look at coffee without adding any milk, it looks like ash drink. Now, if you have a Cree accent, be very careful how you say that. A lot of us Crees don't have that strong sh sound. Sometimes it comes out as ash drink. So anyways, Beagle seas is what we commonly call a black fly, because they look like these little things that go up into the sky from the after you make a fire or during a fire, Beagle seas. And this is, of course, in English, we call this etymology, the origins of words themselves. And this is one of my favorite things to do. It teaches students critical thinking, to question the root words and to take a look at a different way of seeing. The word isquesis is a very powerful word. It literally means little woman. You can see the word isqueo if you just remove the diminutive part of cis. Isqueo means woman. Isquesis is a smaller version of a woman. And traditionally, these types of words were always reminding us that that girl that you're talking to, that isquesis, is a woman to be. And that napesis is the same thing. Napesis, napio. Bigger version, smaller version. It was always a reminder that these kids that you are teaching, these children that you are spending time with, that you are getting to know as an adult, or even as a boy yourself, the language was always there to guide us how we were to conduct our relationships with other people. Esquesis means small woman or a woman to be. So that was always a reminder to pay attention that that girl was going to be like your mom or your auntie or your grandmother someday. And boys and girls learned to respect each other because they were reminded in the words themselves. So there was a lot less bullying, there was a lot less lateral violence, and a lot more appreciation for the people that they were going to be, as opposed to, saying things that you were going to regret, or maybe even treating people, indifferently, without thinking about the future that they have and the gifts that they were going to share someday. So thank you there, Connie, for the note. I definitely will make an effort to make this happen, the story behind Atigami. The appreciation of history and its content, or in its context, land as connection. So many of you do not know where I'm from, maybe even Googled South End Ranger Lake. This is what it looked like when I was growing up. This was about 1995. And my high school that I graduated with would have been completed in 1996, 1997. I was one of the very first people to graduate from my community as a grade 12 student. I never did go to residential school. Every time that I went up a grade to a certain grade, we always had, for a long time, we had grade 9, and then after grade 9, you had to go into the down south in the city of Prince Albert for grade 10. So when I hit grade 10, they added a grade 10 in the community, and then when I hit grade 11, they added the grade 11 and 12. So I kind of think that they didn't want me to go out there because it was too dangerous for me, or maybe the South was not ready for me. But in any case, my traditional community name is called Wapa Te Gochewanok. Wapa Te Gochewanok. Wapa Te Gochewanok. This right here, I'm assuming that people can see my cursor, and it's Wapao. Wapao is a Narrows. and Ipmichawak. So you combine those two, it's a word morph. Wapatigochoano is a word morph, which means, of course, more than a couple words put together to make one. And that means the Narrows with the current is where this community lies, and this is on the south end of Ranger Lake. Not very original in terms of names, but very practical. South end is on the south end of Ranger Lake, a 200-kilometer long lake in northeast Saskatchewan. One of my favorite pieces to point out, especially to educators, is try to show the maps to our students and before the provincial boundaries were put in place. It really does give students an appreciation and a different understanding of why there are so many Cree people that go from the east to the west. We have Cree people in James Bay, and then of course the Naskape, the Innu, those are Algonquin family members. The Algonquin language goes into right into the United States. You know, some people might assume that the word Mississippi is a Cree word because CP is a Cree word for river. Mississippi is a big river, and that's exactly what that means. That's not Cree, but because the Cree language is so close to the other Algonquin language families, we can see the similarities. And so this is one of the things that I like to show is that if you follow the river systems, we can start to understand why Edmonton is a Cree community and why we speak and why we kind of go into the north. And when you start incorporating the history of the fur trade and the expansion west and settlement and pushing everybody to areas that were traditionally only for the winter time, and so there's a lot to unpack, and that's my community of South End Ranger Lake, and that red dot would have been right there, and you can start seeing the connections that we have when you start pointing out the river system, the land, geography. If you take a look at the Precambrian Shield, you can start understanding why we're called the Rock Cree, because you can't dig very far and you hit rock. And the people, our Cree relatives to the south, would basically tell us, the people of the rocks. That's what Asaneskainoak means. The people that live amongst the rocks. And again, these are just the various dialects that we have in Canada, and more of a formal anthropological perspective. But what I always like to say is we have more in common than we have differences. So if you speak Plains Cree and Woods Cree sound similar, or maybe that's the only dialect of Cree that's being taught, I would say learn as much of it as possible. The same thing with Swampy Cree, Ininim when they call it, but that just means the language of the human beings. And Inu, of course, is a human being said in the wide dialect. Idinu, TH dialect, Ininu, N dialect, Ililu or Ilinu is the L dialect. And I'm not as confident to start confirming that this is how we would say these words in the R dialect, because I'm still learning. So these four dialects is what I'm learning, as well as Anishinaabemowin, which means the Ojibwe language. I got about 5 or 10 minutes left. The power of story. Some of you will know that Northern Lights in Cree are called Wawahtiwak, which means those that walk from side to side, those that walk side to side. And part of this teaching and these stories, this is a very common story amongst Cree people, is that Northern Lights are our ancestors that have passed, and they're there to show us that they're happy, they're in a good place, they're in the afterlife, and they just come over to visit a little bit. And so one of the first people to teach me that was my Nogum Pan. So Nogum means my grandmother. Nogum Pan means my late grandmother. Again, when you're teaching the language, have fun. Just like every subject matter that you have, no matter what it is, you spark different parts of the brain when kids can connect and be engaged and just have as much fun as possible. And of course, that's what I do, is I embarrass myself every day teaching the Cree language. Who the hell would say, Simon Says to be part of their name, but that's how much sacrifice I'm doing for the language. Anyways, this is I incorporate into my social media page as one of those backdrops, pictures, and this means mi wa sin is a wide dialect way of saying it is good. Mi wa sin, it is beautiful. And having fun, you don't know where it goes. This little girl was about this age. She was actually a year older. She was about 5 years old when I started teaching her Cree. And I said, Miyogi Sigao. That's a good day, wide dialect. It's a good day, Miyogi Sigao. And she started laughing, and she says, Dad, it sounds like you're saying, may you kiss a cow. And of course, may you kiss a cow is a mnemonic to help you remember Miyogisigao. In TH dialect, we say Midogisigao. Growing up, I grew up with the TH dialect. We would say Midogisigao. My wife's family speaks the Plains Cree Y dialect. And this is what I do online. It's a shortcut. It has its pros and cons, but it helps. When I started teaching way back in 2015, or sharing, that's basically what I do, and ignite conversation on Cree Simon Says. This guy was one of my first members, and I presented with him back in 2018 in Saskatoon for the Language Keepers Conference, and Cameron did not speak a word of English in 2015. What he took, when I shared this word here, Midogisigao or Miyogisigao, right here, Meyo Kisikao, was one of the very first things I posted as I shared the reaction from my daughter. Cameron took a look at that at 18 years old, and he's looking at it as a young kid from Gimli, Manitoba, and he said, that can't be Cree. And he started asking questions in his own family and said, when, I know we have Cree ancestry, and how come we don't speak it, or who was the last person to speak it? And today, because of his journey into the university and into connecting with the Cree community, the elders at the University of Winnipeg, he can actually speak very well. But again, I don't take any credit for that fluency that he has, but that love of language is what he acknowledges as that spark that made him reconnect. And today, Cameron finished off his B.Ed, will be teaching in one of the First Nation communities in Manitoba for 3-year term, for 3 months to finish off the school year as a Cree teacher before going to Montreal for university to study Indigenous language revitalization. And so I just wanted to bring this to a bit of a close. As I talk about, Cree Simon says the initiative itself definitely has some pros and cons. It's bite-sized. It needs to be digestible. It needs to be as seamless as learning, as seamless as possible. I know my role in social media and what I have to offer, and I just use that as one of the avenues to spark or ignite that curiosity for language and that love of learning. And I mean, I'm basically competing against, pop culture, movies, comics, cartoons, video games, everything under the sun. And I've basically taken that recipe or that formula to spark interest in language, and that's all we can do. But in my current studies, again, these are extra slides that I'm not going to go through. My current studies have pointed out that technology in itself is not a silver bullet. Social media is basically a double-edged sword, and everything that we try to do to revitalize the language has to be has to go back to a student focused, a strength-based, and try to incorporate some of those learning opportunities as much as possible. And again, I leave you with this quote from Gala. Candace Gala is an Indigenous language scholar from Hawaii. She teaches out there in one of the universities in BC. And again, any tool is only as beneficial in the way it's used. And I'm sure a lot of our teachers can appreciate that. Unfortunately, some communities have come up with this idea that if you come up with a Facebook group or an app, that's going to revitalize the language. But it really does come back to what we started is it's just a way to connect. And we all know social media. You can go there for a language lesson, and an hour later you're looking at TikToks. So it's definitely supposed to be meant to as a minor tool to engage, to spark conversation, and in the end, hopefully that relationship that you're building with your students can be a lot more valuable in whatever technology has to offer, and engage in those different ways. So with that said, I'll stop sharing. That brings us to about just over 10 minutes for any questions that anybody might have. Mamaskats, that's a mouthful. Awesome. Andrea, Ranger Lake United 3. Thank you very much for that. Midwasan, as we would say up north, or we condensed it to Midwasan. Midwasan, of course, means that's good. I'm going to say humor. Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong in your pronunciation.
Okay. Yeah. So, can you give me an example of how to incorporate mathematics into our teaching? Like, just an example.
Thank you for that. I don't have any specific examples at this time. There are some presenters that I do know that have incorporated mathematics. I should have prepared for that question, but in a lot of ways, one of the things that I would like to say is I wish I had my example here of I usually have a cluster of pens that I grab from a classroom when I'm presenting, and I usually have a pen, pencil, crayon, paintbrush, highlighter, pencil, crayon. And one of the things that I point out is, generally speaking, and very commonly, our people have one name for all these instruments of writing. In English, these animate objects all have different names for the different types of job that they do. So generally speaking, when you compare the unimportance of all these different things, and having the Cree people basically have that one term for that word, masaneganatig or masneganatigus, which means little writing stick. And then you start looking at how people are related and how complex that system of kinship is. You start appreciating that the worldview of Cree people was centered around the connection of people, the connection of the surroundings, the land, the animals. And so that is not a way to answer your question directly, but indirectly, there's a reason why we don't have those off the cuff answers as to why math is different. It's just the worldview of people is always people centered. And again, there are examples. People have these unique interests, and I will try to find that person and recommend that perhaps they can do a presentation on how to incorporate mathematics into, indigenous ways of knowing. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Share a video with you. They're all so quiet. I'm in presentation mode here. One of the things that I'm doing right now is my PhD, I'm focusing on community consistency and capacity as a formula for Indigenous language revitalization in a community setting. And I'm using my family as an example, and I'm incorporating the 6 seasons. And of course, around the 6 seasons are the 12 months of the year and some of the activities that we do. And this is basically a system of matriarchy. We have my grandmother, Nogum, and how this one person was able to introduce such a very unique way of being, and how it's literally a basic system of governance. So taking that the idea of matriarchy and applying to today's modern day governance and systems. And we can compare this to what we do as a school when we're looking at schools as student focused. And this is something of a national project that we're doing at the AFN. It's helping First Nations build their own capacity in terms of governance. And you can, governance would be, you can take a look at the system of governance, and you can change it in so many different ways. I'm working with the federal government on this, and provincial governments and territorial governments all have their own different unique ways of looking at it. And then we have our First Nations that are all taking a look at this differently as well. One of the things that I did want to point out is that the key to long-term results is build capacity among young community members who will carry the language revitalization mission forward. And that includes everything in terms of the jobs that you have as teachers. As teachers, there is a sense of anti-establishment out there for a lot of people. Ever since Idle No More kind of busted that conversational piece open. Coming from an educational background, I take it with a grain of salt, like I do with everything else. There's value in education and a formal education. And I think that having capacity to be able to to sustain, language in terms of governance, housing, and having an infrastructure in place. It all goes back to what my grandmother had, right? She had a community capacity to teach, and she had consistency because she was always there, surrounded by family members. Question here is, oh, awesome. Thank you very much. Memes are a great way to incorporate anything within the language itself. I mean, there's multi-billion-dollar companies that are advertising using memes, TikTok. And so I used to have a small business, and that business was actually making Bannock. And that's one of the things. It was like a one-stop shop for Bannock. You just pour 1 cup of water into to a bag. And when I was doing research, they basically the industry said, why recreate the wheel when you can just copy what everybody else does? So the packaging, the advertisement, the look and the feel of the product itself. I took a look at Kellogg's, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and what they were doing, Old Dutch chips, and I copied it. And it was successful, but I had to put it to rest because I had three jobs at that time. Just to close this off, again, for the second time, a history of disconnection, it is out there. It's good to be able to take a look at the sad reality and the sad history of what industrial schools and residential schools have done, and in terms of segregating and assimilating Aboriginal people into reservation systems. And when up until fairly recently, the banning of ceremonies, cultural practices and stories, all led to the loss of language, identity, and confidence. And this is a quote that I took from Whitehorse. An elder basically stated that our relationship to the river and the land was changing. So we found new ways to make our living. And I take that to mean working with new systems. And that includes education, that includes governance, and that includes business, and that includes resource development. So there's a lot to unpack. You can interpret in different ways, but the reality is change is definitely part of our what we have to do as a society, and incorporating Indigenous language is the ultimate form of respect. Jamie, you have a question?
I was just wondering if you have any advice or suggestions on resources for a beginner speaker or somebody who wants to learn Cree language to utilize in their classroom with their students and stuff. Is there anything like I'm on Cree Simon Says, I'm on a few different sites, but is there anything you would suggest for people that may be listening here who might not know of these places to reach out for things?
Thank you very much. Great question. One of my go-to resources is creeliteracy.org. And if you Google Itui Wina as a dictionary, one of the resources comes from Northern Alberta. I forget the gentleman's name there when he started doing the research and building the dictionary for the Cree, the online Cree dictionary. That's basically what the Tuiwin is. My advice would be, if you take a look at a word or a song or a prayer, and if it's written in the standard Roman orthography, I would say write it in the way you understand it, connect with a speaker and how they would say it, and interpret that into phonetically write it out. So the word dance, sometimes it's pronounced as dance. Two different people might spell that out a bit differently, one with a T and one with a D. And, encourage, phonetically speaking or writing, to be able to start building a foundation of a vocabulary or some of the words that you use on a daily basis, or when you practice a song, prayer, or common terms. I hope that helps there, Jamie. Right on. Well, it's
May I
1:30.
interrupt? Sorry.
Go for
I
it.
just put in chat. I have been studying Cree for a few years. It's a very difficult language. And one series, tapes and texts and workbook that I found really helpful was by Solomon Ratt.
Thank you very
And
much.
I think it's J. Okma. Joan Okma is it's just an amazingly ambitious and clear instruction on like Cree grammar, basically,
Thank you so
and
much.
everything that goes with it. Like it's, yeah.
Jean Ogamau. Jean Ogamau is the name, and that's a tremendous resource if you can get your hands on anything by Solomon Ratt or Jane Ogamau or Eric Wolvengray. Those are some of the my go-to resources as well.
Sorry, what was the last one?
Eric Wolvengray.
Eric.
It's pronounced A-Rock.
Oh, Eric. Okay, and the last name is what? Oh, Wolvengray. Okay, thank you.
First Nations University. All right. Any other questions before we bring this to a close? Thank you for your time, by the way. Appreciate it.
One more thing.
Yeah.
Look up for people in Alberta. Look into the elementary Cree curriculum resources. They have steps and stages of Cree learning. I printed it off myself, and it's very informative. And not only that, but tells you quite specifically what is expected at each grade level. And the sorts of things, like the sorts of constructs that varying levels get into. It's quite intimidating. Like, it's amazing just how much basic Cree covers, right? It's, I mean, we'd all be happy if we learn basic Cree, I'm sure, when we teach in Cree schools, because, but okay, thanks.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very appreciated.
Thank you.
It was there.
I think we're no more questions. It doesn't look like. But thank you so much for your time. I sit through these presentations and write down all these pages and pages of notes, but there was so much, like those root words. Those are just such a powerful thing to know, because it puts you in that idea of, okay, this is what I think that word, this is what I think that word belongs to. This is, I think, yeah, you've been lots of great. And I love the idea of even starting one word at a time. There's so much talk out there right now about phrases, and it needs to be phrases. And so sometimes that's overwhelming and people don't want to start, but even just that one word at a time in your classroom, introducing one word and making it two words, and yeah, just to start somewhere with it.
All right. Perfect. Well, I'll sign out. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see you